Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about Dark Side of the Ring season finale on Black Saturday. An excellent episode of Dark Side of the Ring in which I want to do a little bit of digging, kind of expand on some things that they discussed, as I usually do. In this, we're going to talk about specifically Jim Barnett, the actual purchase of Georgia Championship Wrestling by Vince McMahon, and some of the aftermath, and so, a little bit about Ole Anderson. We're going to be using a lot of reading material here. We're going to be using Ole Anderson's book Inside Out. We're also going to be using Death of the Territories by Tim Hornbaker. We're also going to be using Blood and Fire by Brian Solomon. We're also going to be using Ringside by Scott Beekman. And we're going to be using the NWA book by Hornbaker as well. So there's going to be a lot of, I'm not going to read anything. I'm going to really basically give you the Cliff Notes version of pretty much everything. But it's going to be in a way where you can follow the story and understand what's going on, and to add a little bit more context to some of the incidents that occurred here. Let's start with Jim Barnett. So Jim Barnett is on the ground floor of the NWA. He is actually in the wrestling business in the late 40s, and he's milling about, and he is known as a mover and a shaker. He's a man he has money. He's got connections, and he uses this charisma, this power, that to acquire shares in companies. And at around maybe in the 50s, he owns part of what will become the Detroit territory. Now, this becomes important later, but in 1963, he decides to sell his shares of the Detroit territory, him and his partner Johnny Doyle. They share to Ed Farhat, who is the original Sheik. He sells the territory to him, which gives him parts of Ohio, Detroit, and other parts of Michigan. Now, the reason why this occurred is Jim Barnett had gotten himself into some trouble. Basically, from 1959 to 1963, Jim Barnett was trolling the campuses of the University of Kentucky, bribing the football players with sex and lavish parties. This was detailed in a book called The Thin 30. I have not read the book, but I've read articles on it. And essentially what happens is, for 3 or 4 years, Jim Barnett is using his chateau in Kentucky to recruit football players and trading sex for favors, and sex for money, and sex for free clothes and gifts and things of this sort. And there's other people involved. There's Rock Hudson, one of the famous actors, is involved with this. And Jim Barnett has never been a closeted gay man. So he was openly homosexual and was involved with this scandal. And now it was all coming to light. He's got to get out of Dodge. So he sells all of his shares into all of the various companies that he's invested in. And he bolts. He's getting the hell out of here. He moves to Australia, where he starts one of the many companies called World Championship Wrestling, and actually kickstarts the wrestling business in Australia. And he's gone for several years. Then he turns around and, he decides to come back. In 1973, Jim Barnett is back in the United States, and he purchases Georgia Championship Wrestling from Ray and Lester Welch for $268,000. He owns now 38% of what was called Mid-South Sports Incorporated, which ended up being the parent company for Georgia Championship Wrestling. And of March 1974, he changes the name officially to Georgia Championship Wrestling. So from there, he is now one of the many owners of Georgia Championship Wrestling, along with a couple of other people. TBS comes into the picture in 1976 Turner Broadcasting Systems, or TBS, acquires the broadcasting rights to Georgia Championship Wrestling. 2 hours every Saturday night. Georgia Championship Wrestling is beamed into homes all across the country. Now, since Turner Broadcasting Systems is a national cable network, he's indirectly competing with his other compatriots in the NWA, and there's some bristling about that, even though it wouldn't come to a head for a few years. But one of the people who really gets upset is Ed Farhat, who is now the owner of Big Time Wrestling in Detroit and Ohio, because GCW, or Georgia Championship Wrestling, is becoming very, very popular in the state of Ohio. And now they're starting to expand, and they start running shows in Ohio. This creates a schism between the Sheik and Jim Barnett. And the Sheik expects, as a member of the NWA, that the NWA will protect him from these invasions. But since his promotion is not doing very well in the late 70s, they figure, we just turn a blind eye to it. Sheik gets pissed off. He decides to go work in Georgia, where there's a little bit of a war going on. Georgia Championship Wrestling is going head up with this group that's led by this young lady named Ann Gunkel, and she's running quote unquote outlaw to the NWA. And since you can't be a member of the NWA and run outlaw to the NWA, Ed Farhat is suspended from the NWA for working for an outlaw promotion, even though the NWA is not helping him, as Jim Barnett is running in his backyard. Now, it's important to know that Jim Barnett, as a man of connections, is also very well liked. He's on the NWA board. He is a former vice president of the NWA. He's a former treasurer of the NWA. He's the booker of the World Heavyweight Champion, which is a very prestigious position. He owns parts of other promotions such as Florida and Crockett, which is the Carolinas. So he is a guy who is not to be trifled with in the wrestling business. Before Sheik loses the territory completely, he decides to buckle under and actually start co-promoting shows with Jim Barnett. And he finds suddenly that talent are not showing up. There's a lot of no-shows happening all of a sudden. And, his reputation is being damaged quite a bit. And it's pretty much assumed that there is some sabotage going on here. But he was never able to actually prove it. So here it is, 1976. Jim Barnett is pretty much killing the Sheik and taking over Ohio. But he hires Ole Anderson to be the booker of Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1976. And later on, they find out that there's money being shaved away from the talent. That the shareholders, which would be Barnett and others, Ralph Freed, Jim Oates, etc., they agreed to pay out 25% of the gate to the talent. So Ole Anderson, who was the booker and one of the talent, started realizing that his paychecks ain't really adding up. After some investigation, it is assumed that Jim Barnett is shaving money from the coffers of the money that goes towards the boys. Of course, Ole Anderson is the one making these accusations, and he even later admits that he can't prove it. But this is one of the many things that people are saying is like, this Jim Barnett guy, there's something up with him. In this instance, there's money missing. And Ole Anderson would later say that nobody would ever complain to Jim Barnett about being paid. Even if they thought that the pay wasn't, up to par, nobody ever had anything to say. But when somebody did say something, namely him, Barnett would just pay them out of his pocket. Say, oh, you're just thinking of yourself here. The $200 that you're looking for, I'll just pay it for you right now. And it turns out that he always assumed that Barnett was stealing, but if only one person complains, then only one person gets their money back. Ole Anderson also tells stories that Jim Barnett was a conniving bastard and a master manipulator, and that he would often fly to Florida and complain that Georgia isn't doing well enough. He's in Ole's book, he would mention that they were doing 13,000 selling out the Omni, but Jim Barnett would go and complain that it's not 16,000. And he, in the book, says that Barnett has started getting spoiled. That essentially, he always wanted more. There was never enough. There was never, kind words between the two of them. There was always an issue. So in 1979, Ole Anderson quits. He doesn't want to be the booker for Jim Barnett anymore, and he leaves. Barnett then uses his connections, namely Eddie Graham, Bill Watts, and others, to call Ole Anderson and try to get him to return as booker of Georgia Championship Wrestling. During this time, Bill Watts is also booking Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Ole Anderson thinks that this is a Bill Watts, idea, that while they're calling him saying, oh yeah, you should definitely come back, Bill Watts actually took the job and is doing it. At this point, Ole Anderson said, look, I'll come back, but I want $2,400 to book. Plus, I want main event money when I work. And I want a flight back and forth to Wisconsin every other week. Because in Wisconsin, Ole Anderson owns a sawmill that he has to oversee. So he wants to be flown back and forth to Wisconsin every other week. And Jim Barnett actually agrees to this. He claims that it lasted about 6 months before Barnett started to grumble, and says that he's going to hire an assistant booker by the name of Robert Fuller to help when Ole Anderson is not there. Ole Anderson gets frustrated about this. He doesn't want to have a co-booker, and he decides he's going to quit. So he quits. And that's pretty much it. In 1980, Ole Anderson has quit again. This is the second time he's quit. He quit back in 1974 or 1975 as a wrestler because him and Jim Barnett had gotten into it about money. Despite the fact that he has quit as the booker, he is still floating around as one of the shareholders for the promotion. In 1982, they find out that Georgia Championship Wrestling is in some financial troubles. Ole Anderson decides to go have a look-see about what's going on, and they find out that there is money missing from the box office. This is described in Dark Side of the Ring as, Ole Anderson kicking in the door to the office and going through the books. So, Ole Anderson tells the story that Jim Barnett often tried to keep up appearances that he was a multimillionaire. That he often told people that he came from old money. That, his father was in oil or something like that. But in reality, he was a guy who borrowed a lot from other people, and he was a scammer, essentially. He stole money here, he stole money there. He would borrow and never pay people back. That kind of thing. And he had never really realized this until around this time when he figures out that there's money missing from Georgia Championship Wrestling. Around this same time, Ole Anderson basically says, look, nobody's going to question Jim Barnett. What is going on here? We need to go ask some questions. So him being Ole Anderson and Ralph Freed, they go pay a visit to Jim Barnett. And this is discussed in Dark Side of the Ring as well, as Ole Anderson basically telling Jim Barnett, it's over. I'm going to be voted the chairman. I'm going to take over the company. And this becomes part of a big schism, because Jim Barnett's like, okay, you want to take over the company? Fine, do your thing. I want a salary though, and he's basically being told he's going to be a figurehead from now on, be the, executive vice president of blah, 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 or the on-air commissioner or whatever. And he thinks that he should get paid for this. And Ole Anderson says, well, no, I don't think so, because we need that money to keep the lights on. Why in the world would I keep paying you? At this point, Jim Barnett's like, okay, you don't want to give me any money. You know, you already took the company from me, essentially, even though he's still a shareholder. He's just not in control of the company anymore. And you don't want to pay me. Oh, okay. I mean, you basically set him right up to go to Vince, right? So 1983, Jim Barnett clicks up with Jack and Jerry Briscoe. Now, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, I'm glad Gerald Briscoe was in the documentary to give their side of the story. But as it was told in Gerald Briscoe's side of the story, they had swore this blood oath in a hotel room with Ole Anderson. And Ole Anderson promised them a certain amount of money. That a certain amount of money was $750 a week. Ole Anderson then claims that the Briscoes complained that $750 wasn't enough. But he says, look, we can barely afford to give you guys $750 a week. He said that the Briscoes threatened to not show up to work unless they got $1,200. And then, well, he says, look, this is too much. And so he decided we can't pay that. So Jim Barnett then pipes in and says, well, maybe you make too much money, Ole Anderson. So Ole Anderson gives himself a pay cut. Only he didn't increase the Briscoes' money. He tried to keep it the same. And nope, that's not what they asked. Ole Anderson then accuses Jim Barnett of sending Vince McMahon a copy of the Articles of Incorporation. This is what he did in his book. He claims that Vince McMahon knew about the clause in the Georgia Championship Wrestling Articles of Incorporation, the buy-sell agreement, that you really have to offer your shares to somebody in the company before you sell to somebody outside of the company. Ole Anderson claims that he knew about the poison pill that was within this thing and tried to get it changed, but people thought, it was no big deal. But the poison pill was that if 51% of the shareholders can change the bylaws. So the Briscoes collectively owned about 15%. And then maybe there were some other people involved. And then, of course, Jim Barnett is involved. That gives Vince McMahon over 51%. They then go in and change the bylaws so that everybody can sell their shares to Vince McMahon, which is what happened. At that point, Ole Anderson filed a lawsuit only to lose because they did everything by the book, which is why he accuses Jim Barnett of sending the Articles of Incorporation to Vince McMahon, because how the hell did he know how to do that? How did he know that? Well, in any event, Vince McMahon now owns the majority of Georgia Championship Wrestling, thanks to Jim Barnett. Ole Anderson claims, and it's again asserted in Dark Side of the Ring, that his mom died in March of 1984. Vince buys the company in April of 1984. Actually, April the 4th, 1984 is when he actually purchased the shares. But then after all of the injunctions and everything, Vince doesn't actually take control of the company until July of 1984. Apparently the Briscoes made $600,000. Ole Anderson is not sure whether that was collective or a piece, even though I'm pretty sure it was collectively, if that's the appropriate figure. And Jim Barnett and the Briscoes pretty much got jobs for life. Now, we know that Gerald Briscoe was working for WWE until, I think, 2022 or 2021 or something. And Jim Barnett, it didn't last nearly as long. I don't think he made it out of the 80s. But Vince kept his word to Gerald Briscoe, at least. So that's the Jim Barnett portion of the story, that he's the master manipulator, the kingmaker, who pretty much betrays everybody. You know, he set up the Sheik in Detroit, sold him the promotion, the first non-white wrestling promoter, if I remember correctly, because Ed Farhat was Lebanese. And then he backstabbed him a few years later, and then let his friends punish him for trying to retaliate. And that's just basically Jim Barnett. And that's on top of the whole stuff with the prostitution of the college age boys and all that other weird stuff right there. Like real scumbag behavior. If you read about Jim Barnett, he's just not a good guy. Not the best guy, and not a guy you want to spend too much time with. But knew how to maneuver, knew how to get what he wanted out of a situation, knew how to get what he needed out of a situation, and knew how to really work his connections. And having that connection to Vince McMahon to punish Ole Anderson for taking the company from him was immaculate. It's like something out of a comic book. It's like some Lex Luthor level stuff that he's doing here, You're like, oh, you caught me stealing money. All right, I was embezzling, but that didn't give you a right to not pay me. So I'm just going to take everything. Despite all the terrible things that Ole Anderson said about Jim Barnett, in his FBI profile from 1979, Jim Barnett is described as, honestly, he was always described in positive terms. Dependable, bright, conscientious. And they spoke to various people as he was getting involved with, politics. So that means that the FBI is going to start watching him. And one of the quotes is from September 1979. It says, "The appointee is a fine man with whom to be associated. We describe the appointee to have good business sense." So, doesn't sound like a guy who would steal a ton of money, but of course this was before that would have occurred, years before that would have occurred. Fred Ward, who was one of the owners of Georgia Championship Wrestling, says that he had been associated with Jim Barnett for 7 years. And in those 7 years, he's found Jim Barnett to be bright, conscientious, and dependable. That was, a recurring theme here is people would talk about Jim Barnett, at least in the late 1970s, openly positive. And you wouldn't hear all of this stuff about him stealing money, or you certainly didn't hear anything about him being involved with college football players and something that was untoward of that nature. But that, of course, is true because even in the FBI reports, they mentioned that he had a house in Louisville at one point in time, and then he left to go to Australia, but it doesn't say why. It's like, how did the FBI not know? Who were they talking to? Well, they talked to James Oates, another one of the people who owned a piece of Georgia Championship Wrestling, and says that he finds the appointee, that would be Jim Barnett, to be excellent, of excellent family background, and known him to engage in any activity, never known him to engage in activities such as drinking alcohol to excess or using drugs, which would cause embarrassment to himself or his family. Oates stated that the appointee morals, reputation, choice of associates, and loyalty to the United States were without question, and added that he was a very personable, responsible, and trustworthy person. This is the same guy who just 16 years prior to this was involved with prostituting boys. The FBI. They apparently are not good at their jobs and never been good at their jobs. And these people who are speaking so glowingly about Jim Barnett, known him for a long time, but only knew him in terms of business, gave him a glowing review. So it sounds like Jim Barnett is just like everybody else. There are some people who like you and some people who don't like you. And you can take of that which you will. So the next section, we're going to discuss Vince McMahon, because I want to expand on Vince McMahon and how this whole thing with Georgia Championship Wrestling and TBS fell apart, Because yes, it is partially true what they told, but there is also a little bit more to it that could probably be fleshed out. 1982, Vincent Kennedy McMahon talks his father, Vincent James McMahon, into selling him the World Wrestling Federation for $1 million. And this will be paid out in, first off, a lump sum, and the rest in increments. This would also include the other shareholders, one of which was Gorilla Monsoon, another would be Arnold Scotland, and I think it was one other gentleman. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head. So Vince McMahon takes complete ownership of WWF, meaning he has purchased the company from his father and all of the other shareholders, and the deal is done in about June 1983. Vince McMahon then begins national expansion, aggressive expansion. He goes up to Calgary, he buys out Stu Hart. He goes over to California, he buys out the LaBelles. And he's going around trying to buy promotions. And essentially, if he can't do it, he starts attacking the TV networks. He goes in these days, you had to pay the television network to be on the air. It's not like today where they pay you. So he would go into the TV networks, promise them more money, get the local show kicked off, and take over. And if you wouldn't sell to him, he would do that, or he would just offer your top guys more money to come work for him in New York. And he does this all across the country. Now, we're going to talk about specifically Georgia. Now, we've already discussed that Vince McMahon gets control of Georgia via Jim Barnett. He gets the Briscoes, Jim Barnett gets the other shareholders, and they all get together and they sell to Vince McMahon. So in April of 1984, Vince McMahon now owns Georgia Championship Wrestling. Jim Cornette's favorite part of this whole conversation is when Ole Anderson, as Vince wraps up all the legal stuff, Ole has sued and he's lost. Vince is shaking everybody's hand, smiling, and everything is going great. Ole Anderson says, F you. And that's pretty much it. They meet at television. Ole Anderson still owns a certain percentage of the company, but Vince is the boss. Vince brings Linda and introduces Linda. Ole says, F you and F Linda. And Ole says in his book, at this point, Vince McMahon told him, you will never work in this business again. Now, it's not entirely true, but Ole Anderson admits that he never did anything of note after he said F Linda. That was pretty much the end of his career. But Ole Anderson, he's not one to give up. He decides he's going to go into business with Ann Gunkel. They go to Ted Turner because Ted Turner is not happy with Vince. We'll get into that for a second. And they get another show. They get a Georgia Championship Wrestling show, or Championship Wrestling from Georgia. And they get a Saturday morning, 7 a.m., 1 hour time slot. And all of a sudden, the talent starts to disappear. Ole Anderson in the book discusses, he would go to the boys and find out, they would each tell him straight to their face, oh no, Ole, I'm not going to go work for Vince, Ted DiBiase, Nikolai Volkov, Don Jardine, the spoiler, all these guys, oh, I'm not going to go work for Vince, oh no. And then they would pop up on WWF TV. And he had no talent. And because he didn't have any talent, who was going to watch his show? And so his show basically withered on the vine. And apparently this stuff actually started before Vince bought the company, with some of that sabotage, which is, again, if you're following along, it's a Jim Barnett specialty. It happened in Detroit. Guys started to no-show. People started to disappear. Now, this is not a complete conspiracy, because even guys like Harley Race started to no-show Georgia shows at some point, basically due to payoffs. But it's becoming like very suspicious that whenever Vince McMahon is around, guys start to no-show, and of course, your TV networks start to grumble about how much you're paying them, or if you just can't pay them at all, you're going to get kicked off the network. So Vince McMahon has killed Ole Anderson twice in this story. I mean, he really gave Ole Anderson the blues, huh? In any event, Vince McMahon, owner of Georgia Championship Wrestling, World Championship Wrestling, and he's now starting to butt heads with Ted Turner. And this was almost immediate. Due to their agreement, this is something that should be mentioned. And it's whenever Jim Cornette is involved with telling this story, these bits never appear in the story. It's always, the people hated it. The people hated the product. Well, according to Tim Hornbaker, they haven't been able to see how many people actually hated the product. In fact, they could only verify that there were 83 complaints in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution of people who didn't like the WWF product. Now, there's more than 83 people in the whole of Atlanta, but maybe those are only 83 people that felt strong enough to complain. But here is the bigger issue Ted Turner had with the product. There was a couple of agreements that Ted Turner and Vince McMahon came to that Vince broke almost immediately. One, Ted Turner wanted the company to have a regional feel, so he wanted these matches to be taped in a studio in Atlanta. Vince McMahon says, my roster is too big. I can't get Atlanta in my loop. I'm going to tape matches in Philadelphia. I'm going to tape matches in New York City, and I'm going to show them on your network in clear violation of what you asked me to do. So Ted Turner is not happy about this at all. He says, I want you to tape the show in Atlanta in front of a studio. Vince says, nah, it's more big time if you can see like Madison Square Garden or the Spectrum. It aren't these bigger venues is big time. Make your promotion feels big time. And Ted Turner is like, that's not what I asked you to do. You know, like it's that simple. Like I asked you to do one thing and you're telling me you're not going to do it. So Vince says, I ain't going to do it. So that's already a problem. So Vince decides, you know what? I'll bring in all of Ted Turner's favorites. I'll bring in the Fabulous Freebirds. I'll bring in the Spoiler. I'll bring in Mr. Wrestling 2. I'll bring in all of those guys because Ted Turner likes those guys, but they won't be in Atlanta. They'll be in Philadelphia. They'll be in New York City, which is still not to what Ted Turner asked him to do. But this had an underlying meaning to it. Remember, these are the guys that Ole Anderson is trying to book for his promotion. You know, these Georgia guys who are extremely popular. And Vince is like, well, I'll book them because that's what Ted Turner wants, but I ain't going to Atlanta. You can forget it. I'm not going to Atlanta. And Ted Turner is like, I want wrestling in Atlanta. So he brings in Ole Anderson's wrestling show, but it dies because Vince took all the stars out of the state and basically just ran off with them and refused to give them back, even though the Freebirds weren't in WWF very long. But it was long enough that Ole Anderson really couldn't get his feet wet, and his promotion essentially dies. So that's issue number one, is that Ted Turner wants a local wrestling show, and Vince McMahon does not want to do a local wrestling show. So issue number two that comes up is that the WWF want to bring their own advertisers. Ted Turner is like, no, we want to sell advertisers because we want to make money off this thing. And, you know, the WWF like, why we can't have our own advertisers? Like Vince is like, why not? And Ted Turner's like, no, we want the money off of this thing. We're not helping you make more money. What's going on here? But we will offer you some ad time at a reduced rate. And Vince is like, okay, well, I'll take that. And so the WWF has advertising time, which they resell to other advertisers. I know it's kind of hard for people to understand, but you could book your advertisers through the WWF to get on TBS. That was the goal, right? So this works out for a little while until Ted Turner is like, wait a second, Vince, don't you have a show on USA Network Vince is like, I have 2 shows on New USA Network, actually. Because he just bought the Southwest Championship Wrestling's time slot. He already had a time slot. He bought their time slot too. So now he's got 2 programs on USA Network. And Ted Turner's like, nah. You can't work for my competition. And Vince is like, why not? He's like, because they're my competition. And he's like, pal, tough shit, pal. What is this? So Ted Turner says, look, we need you guys to be exclusive to TBS. That's what we need. Vince is like, nope, not doing that. USA loves us. We're not leaving USA. So Ted Turner's like, that commercial time that we've been selling you guys at a reduced rate, forget that. You got to pay full rate now. And Vince is like, we're not paying you nothing. We ain't paying you jack. So that becomes a problem. So then Ted Turner starts to complain about the ratings. The ratings should be better. Now, why isn't the ratings much, much better? You're supposed to be a higher end product. Why isn't your ratings beating the Georgia ratings? And Vince is like, come on, man, you busting my balls here. I got 2 wrestling shows. Oh, yeah, maybe you were right. Maybe I shouldn't have so much wrestling on television. But, it is what it is. One of them is a clip show, so does it really count? All American Wrestling, which aired on USA Network, which they talked about in Dark Side of the Ring, was actually a compilation show. It was a compilation of all the different wrestling promotions across the country. They would send Vince tapes, and he would show their matches on USA Network. Of course, this had an underlying meaning of him trying to steal the stars that he was showcasing, but he was sharing airtime with these other promotions on USA. That was just on one of his shows. But he was producing too much content. That was pretty much, a lot of it is on cable at the same time. The ratings for the TBS show start to diminish. So because Vince does not want to give exclusivity to Ted Turner decides, well, I don't need to be exclusive either. He brings in Bill Watts and Mid-South Championship Wrestling to run opposition to Vince. So now he's got 2 wrestling promotions, and Vince is like, no, you can't do that. And Ted Turner, well, yes, I can. It's my network. So a year into this thing, these guys have had some huge issues that are beyond just, the people hated the product. It was also a poor business arrangement. Vince McMahon did not want to give Ted Turner all the things Ted Turner felt like he needed to be a good business partner. He wouldn't give him exclusivity. He would not tape the show in Atlanta like Ted Turner asked. And all of this stuff began to magnify the problems that already existed. So while Vince technically did defeat Ole Anderson twice in this story and pretty much beam the WWF across the country with 2 shows on USA and the 2-hour show on TBS, he's bumping heads with Ted Turner and things are not going well. So he has to sell the show. He starts shopping around the product, finds Jim Crockett. Jim Crockett is willing to pay $1 million for it. So Jim Crockett gives Vince McMahon $1 million. Vince McMahon says, okay, I'll take your $1 million. See ya. Jim Crockett turns that 2 hours on TBS into a huge hot property again because there was some cross-pollination between the wrestlers of the Carolinas, Florida, and Georgia. This was one of the benefits of Jim Barnett having cable television when he was in control, and one of the reasons why he was able to get away with it for so long, having shows in other people's territories, is because guys who worked in Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas, there was a lot of cross-pollination. So if just because you were on TV in Georgia, it could help you draw money in Florida because you were on TV. And if you were on TV in the Carolinas, it would help you draw money in the Carolinas. So those guys didn't complain too much, while other people, maybe the folks in Ohio, they did complain because, you're a little bit further in terms of being based further away. but you're beaming your show right into our backyard. It was something similar with the Von Erichs, if I remember correctly. They also had, when they got a cable show, it was also the same thing with the WWF. Whenever somebody had cable, that was going to be an issue because you couldn't control where the show went. So the episode essentially ends with what happened to Jim Barnett. Is that he was fired from WWE when he eventually went into loggerheads with Vince. If I remember correctly, he went to be an advisor to WCW for a little while. And then he pretty much got out of the wrestling business and passed away in 2004. They ended the show talking about Vince McMahon and the hush money scandals and the sex trafficking lawsuit, which is extremely interesting considering Jim Barnett was involved with male prostitution for 4 years and fled the country. So, I mean, what an interesting thing for them not to mention in this documentary. Like, oh yeah, Jim Barnett, he likely taught Vince McMahon all these nice little tricks, the trades here, and not mention that Jim Barnett was into turning freshmen into prostitutes and giving them lavish gifts, which sounds almost exactly like what Vince McMahon did to this young lady. You know, invite her over for, dinners and wine and dine and trading sex for favors like jobs. Almost the entire situation sounds very, very eerily similar to what Vince McMahon would do later. And it would have been a nice little dovetail to the story. You got Vince and Jim Barnett, the evil king and his vizier next to him. And it's amazing how many times Vince McMahon ends up really working with like non-closeted homosexuals who have been involved with scandals. That's very bizarre. It's not a strange thing for it to happen once, but for it to happen twice, that's kind of weird. Kind of like Jim Barnett is already he's maybe it's fair for you to not know. It was 1963 when this thing got busted. Vince would have been 1963. He'd have been like 18 or something like that when it occurred, and probably would have been on his way to college himself, not really in the loop about what Jim Barnett was up to in 1960 or whatever, when Vince was 15 years old. Jim Barnett was whining and dining football players. It's gross. And then, of course, if you're one to believe the Pat Patterson Cream Team's Ring Boy scandal in the late 80s, early 90s in the WWF, and of course now Vince McMahon's sex scandal with this Janelle Grant lawsuit. Just weird that this thing would happen more than once. It's just weird that it would happen more than once, that Vince McMahon would be involved with a homosexual who has himself been involved with a sex scandal. Just very odd. It doesn't happen to anybody once, and it happened to Vince twice. Strange. Very strange. So, Dark Side of the Ring. Did a really good episode with this one. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed Ole Anderson's son, who looks a lot like Ole Anderson, has his temperament too. Like, I can almost feel the intensity through the screen when Ole Anderson's son was on there. Nick Patrick was in there. That was very good. I like that too. That was very interesting. All the little guys who used to work in Georgia Championship Wrestling telling their story, of course. It was excellent. In that regard, this was one of the best episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. I wanted to, in this, not to lambast Dark Side of the Ring because they have a time limit and I don't. They have a time limit to do this stuff. I don't. But I wanted to show that there is a lot more to the story than the Dark Side of the Ring can get into. And for all of you sharp cookies out there, this is absolutely how the Vince McMahon, Ted Turner 90s wrestling war began. It began with them being partners in the 80s, and not getting along. It began with Ted Turner and Vince going tit for tat while they were contractually obligated to be together for a short amount of time, even though this all happened without Ted Turner's permission. That Georgia Championship Wrestling ended up in the hands of one Vince McMahon. That wasn't a Ted Turner idea, but they ended up in business, and Vince broke all of these contracts, and Ted Turner ended up having to chastise him for it, and this spilled over into Vince hating Ted Turner into the 90s. So the Monday Night War is directly connected to Black Saturday and everything that led up to it, as you can see. And that was really what I wanted to get here, is to connect all of those things, not just, Jim Barnett being a degenerate and how that connects to Vince McMahon being a degenerate, but also how Ted Turner and Vince McMahon not getting along in 1984 led to them being in a war against each other in 1994 through 2001. It's just very interesting to learn those stories and to get the backstories and hear the tales from people that you don't talk a lot about, like Ole Anderson, to get, more information on a guy like a Jim Barnett. And this is something Dark Side of the Ring, they can't do because they can only have so much time with commercials. They have to hit the highlights and they miss some of the details. And, but this was a very good episode of Dark Side of the Ring. It was absolutely excellent. I suggest it. It was probably one of the best Dark Side of the Ring episodes, up there with the Benoit, up there with the Pillman. And it was that good. All right. Thank you guys for your time, and I will talk to you guys later.
Skin tone, so why attach yourself and piggyback the wealth you didn't earn or lack yourself? I'm telling you to own up to your own success and failures. It's a reason.